Hello again. So, where we left off, we were in our section about sourcing and procurement, and we were talking about the procurement process. And we had gotten through the first four steps, the first one being recognition of need, the second being description of need, the third, identification and analysis of possible sources of supply, the fourth being supplier selection and the determination of terms. And then what we're going to start on now is step 5, preparation and finalization of the purchase order or contract. And remember, the procurement process, these 9 steps are not the end all be it, the holy grail, the exact processes. It's going to vary a little bit. There is going to be, depending on where you go in terms of the best steps or the best processes, it's going to vary, but this is a good guideline in terms of the general steps and processes of this entire procurement process from the very start of when we realize we're going to need something to the very end. So let's get started with our step 5. Well, let's see. Okay, let's see. There we go. Okay, step 5, preparation and finalization of the purchase order or contract. So let's go through some definitions of what is a purchase order and what is a contract. So a purchase order, which you'll sometimes hear of termed as a PO, this is a commercial document that is sent from the buyer to the seller with the request for the product. And when that is accepted by the seller, it is a legally bound contract is formed through that transaction between the buyer and the seller. The purchase order usually consists of descriptions, it consists of quantities, it consists of price, it consists of any discounts, delivery dates of the product. So it's a very straightforward, usually very simple document. And a contract. So a contract, this is a legal document that details the products or services that are being sold, sets the agreed upon prices, it defined the terms and conditions, which you may hear the term T's and C's. That's what that refers to, is terms and conditions of the agreement, usually for a certain time period. So there'll be a certain time period that is the length of the contract. And usually we're going to use a contract when it's more complex. There's a complex set of terms associated with this purchase that go above and beyond usually the very standard boilerplate terms that are associated with a PO. Usually the terms and conditions on a PO, it's 1 page or less. If you have something more complex that requires a lot more legal documentation that is going to be multiple pages long, you're going to use a contract. When the risk level of the purchase or the acquisition is higher, it is a better idea to use a contract. So when the risk level is higher, the complexity is higher, the dollar amount is higher, usually it is wiser to use a contract over a purchase order or a PO. So let's talk about the differences between purchase orders versus contracts. Let's talk more about how they're similar and how they're different. So POs, purchase orders, are commercial documents, whereas a contract is a legally binding document. Purchase orders do not become legally binding until the seller actually accepts them. The contract, on the other hand, is a legal document from the very beginning as soon as both parties sign it. So again, PO is a commercial document and a contract is a legally binding document. And usually, the riskier the business transaction, the better it is to use a contract. The contract holds more legal value than a purchase order, so that is going to protect both parties from risk. Contracts very clearly spell out the responsibilities of each party, the performance standards, and usually they're going to contain very exhaustive terms and conditions, T's and C's, and again, going to reduce risk for both parties. Contracts do not necessarily outline exact quantities or delivery times, so those granular details are sometimes not included in the contract. So usually contracts are used in conjunction with purchase orders. So that is very common, is that if a contract is used, it is usually also used in conjunction with a purchase order. And purchase orders usually represent one single business transaction, whereas like I want to order 10 iPhones. I'm going to order 10 iPhones. I would put in a PO for 10 iPhones. Contracts are typically for long-term arrangements between buyers and sellers. Perhaps the agreement that I have between that seller that sells iPhones for the period of 5 years, that would be what I would use a contract for. Contracts could outline the terms to be used for all the different purchase orders from that vendor within that time frame that we have that contract. And again, so purchase orders should be used only for short-term purchases, while contracts are better for building very long-term buying relationships. So PO short-term, contract long-term. So a contract may take several different forms depending on depending on how much, depending on from whom the organization is buying. Some very common contract types include fixed price contracts, cost contracts, time and materials contracts, sometimes referred to as T&M contracts, and indefinite delivery contracts. And we're going to go over all of these different types of very common contracts. So firm fixed price contracts, sometimes you'll hear the term FFP, or fixed price contract. So with a fixed price contract, the price is set and it's not subject to change at all. You cannot change it under any circumstance. This price is fixed. Most buyers prefer this type of contract. We want to lock in a good price and ensure that this is the price it's going to be regardless of what happens. However, if we have a firm fixed price contract and the delivery for whatever we're ordering is months away, or it could be years away, there could be a risk of inflation, of price escalation. And suppliers may feel this is too risky for them, and they may not agree to it because it is so far in advance and they're taking on so much risk in case there is some sort of price escalation. It's also very difficult to get any types of services, to any kind of intangible services that isn't like a tangible product. It's hard to get services to agree to firm fixed price contracts because historical practice of hourly building, there's also something called scope creep, where we say we want something, but then it keeps getting higher and higher and higher. And the concern from the supplier standpoint is if they agree to a fixed price contract and there is scope creep, they are not going to make any profit on that because it's going to cost them more to perform the services. So it's very difficult to get any sort of service supplier to agree to a firm fixed price contract. However, a firm fixed price contract is a very good methodology of contract if it's very simple, if it's very straightforward, if it is a physical commodity or good that is going to be delivered in the very short term. And again, typically buyers like this type of contract and suppliers are a little bit more hesitant because they're taking on all the risk. The next type of contract we have is a cost contract. So that would be where we, as the buying organization, would reimburse the supplier for their exact costs, exactly what they paid for whatever that product or service is. And usually it also allows them to charge an additional negotiated amount, usually some sort of fee or profit. Usually there's kind of a ceiling which they're allowed to bill at. So suppliers are allowed to incur these reimbursable costs up to a predetermined level or ceiling. And the fee, the profit that we would pay them is often fixed at a certain percentage of the cost. So suppliers like this one because they're going to get paid exactly what it costs them to perform the service, to create the good and deliver it. And plus we're going to pay them an additional fee. So the suppliers prefer this type of contract. And time and materials contracts, sometimes called T&M contracts. These are most often used for reactive repairs. This is when we as the buying organization agree to pay the supplier for fixed labor rates. So that's where the time comes in. We're paying them for the time it takes them, the labor, and then the actual materials, the actual cost of parts, materials used on the product, on the project. So that is where the term time and materials comes from. Most vehicle repairs, when you take your car into the shop to get fixed, most vehicle repairs are time and materials contracts. They are going to charge you for the labor hours and then the actual cost of parts. So that is what a time and materials contract is, T&M, and most often used for reactive types of repairs, where something breaks, we need someone to come out and fix it. And then the final contract we're going to talk about is an indefinite delivery contract, also called, sometimes you'll hear indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity, or IDIQ. This is when we as the buying organization, we don't really know. We don't know how much we're going to need, how much we're going to order, or when we're going to need whatever it is that we know, but we know we're going to need it. We just don't know when and how much. And usually these types of contracts provide minimum, so there's a floor, and a maximum, a ceiling of quantities for suppliers. So perhaps an example of an indefinite delivery contract is the minimum could be, we know that we're going to need to order at least 1,000 tables, but it's not going to be more than 20,000 tables. So there is kind of a window within there, within, let's say, a year. This gives us as the buying organization a lot of flexibility to purchase as much or as little as we actually need, as long as it falls within that agreed upon range. It's useful when our production schedule is very likely to vary if we have a very volatile demand schedule or we don't have it finalized yet. This is a really good way to contract with a supplier and give them some kind of heads up, even if we don't have the exact specifications, the exact quantity, or the exact timeline. So this is when we just don't know exactly the quantities or the timeline when we need it, but we've got an idea of the range. So contracts and agreements are sometimes very innocently structured with some fundamental flaws. Again, all organizations go into some sort of contracting agreement between two parties, the buying organization and the supplier, usually with good intentions. And sometimes when we structure these, we put these flaws into the structure, that's going to impact the relationships. A huge piece of sourcing and procurement, especially with sourcing, is managing the suppliers and those relationships. In some cases, depending on how the contract is structured, you could have one extremely powerful, usually the buyer or the supplier, that is going to use its power. It's going to, perhaps they're very good negotiators, and they're going to shift all of the risk onto that weaker partner. So if we don't structure our contracts well, that can result in something called perverse incentives. So these are negative behaviors, or perhaps they're unconscious behaviors that drive unintended consequences and essentially ruin everything that that contract agreement is supposed to be actually performing. So we're going to review the 10 outsourcing ailments that afflict and weaken business relationships. So this was actually written about in a book called The Vested Outsourcing Manual. And it was written by University of Tennessee researchers who are, University of Tennessee is actually one of the best schools, the undergraduate programs for supply chain. So the University of Tennessee researchers were working with the United States Air Force, and they uncovered these 10 outsourcing ailments as part of a research contract that they had with the Air Force. And the reason is that the Air Force wanted to know why they had some contracts and some relationships with certain suppliers that were so successful, and then other ones that may have been very, very similar in all aspects, but they failed miserably. So the Air Force wanted to know, so that they contracted with the University of Tennessee to do a little bit of research. And again, if we have these structural flaws in our contracts, or we've got maybe like behavioral or cultural issues in our organization, that's going to prevent really strong and effective collaborations and have a good outcome on our contracts. And that's going to ultimately lead to very uncomfortable relationships between buyer and supplier, and really wasted opportunities for efficiencies that contracts are supposed to create. So let's go through the 10 outsourcing ailments. So, and again, they've got kind of quaint names for all of these. So we've got 10 of them, and we're going to go through each of them. We've got penny wise and pound foolish. We've got the outsourcing paradox. We've got the activity trap, the junkyard dog factor, the honeymoon effect, sandbagging, the zero-sum game, driving blind disease, measurement minutia, and the power of not doing. These are our 10 outsourcing ailments. So you've probably wondered where the name for the clown in It came from. The name of that clown is Pennywise. So it actually comes from this saying, penny wise and pound foolish. So someone who is penny wise but pound foolish, they're very careful with really tiny amounts of money, like pennies, nickels, dimes, yet they're very wasteful with extravagant large sums of money. This would be like someone who refuses to buy a Snickers candy bar, a $1 candy bar, but spends extravagant amounts on vehicles or clothing, thousands and thousands of dollars of money. And it just doesn't make sense. So this happens in a business arrangement when a company outsources and they do it based on purely costs. They want to get some sort of cost savings out of it. So they strong arm their suppliers and their service providers into getting the absolute rock bottom lowest price. And again, we end up getting what we pay for. And if they are getting the lowest absolute cost, they're probably not getting a very good quality product or service. So they have to do a lot of frequent bidding. There's always a continuous search. Maybe they have to put it out for bid every year, every 2 years. And they view outsourcing as this quick fix solution to resolve any kind of money problems that they're having. And the problem with this sort of mindset is that when you're outsourcing, when you're working with suppliers, businesses need to think beyond the short-term bottom line. It's about long-term total cost of ownership, best value. So the danger in focusing on the absolute rock bottom price, the absolute cheapest offer, is that it's going to lead to trade-offs in quality and our service. So often companies who suffer from penny wise and pound foolish mentality, they fall into this loop of frequently bidding out their work, picking the lowest price provider, and then transitioning to that supplier, and the quality is poor, and then they're going to just start that cycle again. So it leads to this very vicious cycle of bid, transition to new supplier, doesn't work out well. Bid, transition to new supplier, doesn't work out well. And they never really give the suppliers a chance to actually perform well. And they're just focused on that bottom line. But at the end, the total cost of ownership is going to be a lot higher, and they're never going to get quality products or services. So that's penny wise and pound foolish. That's our first one. Our second one is the outsourcing paradox. So this ailment typically starts off where we've got our experts in our buying organization, and I'll say experts, at the company that's going to be outsourcing, and they develop what they deem are the perfect set of tasks, the perfect set of frequencies, the perfect set of measures, the exact specifications from we need for this supplier. And we're going to create this huge, long, very impressive document containing every possible scenario, every possible detail on how the work is actually supposed to get done. However, it is not one that is actually designed by the provider of the services or the product, who is supposed to be the expert at getting the job done. That is why we are outsourcing, because usually we are not the experts in it. This other company is. So this really constrains our suppliers' innovative capabilities to the boundaries of our incredibly over-prescriptive statement of work. So again, we think we're the best at it, so we create exactly what the supplier is going to be doing, but actually they're the experts, and we should allow them to bring their creativity, to bring their innovation, and kind of guide us in a sense. Usually this requires a lot of frequent approvals from us as the buying organization. And so a lot of times the supplier can't go forward and do anything until they get the approval from the buying organization. So there's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of paperwork. This often occurs when the decision to engage into a business relationship is made for the first time. So when a company first decides that we're going to move this from in-house to outsourcing, something that we used to do in the past, and the fear that we have about losing control is really high. This is very, very common for very complex services that end up being outsourced. So that is the outsourcing paradox, where we don't allow the suppliers to actually bring their innovation, bring their skill, and bring us a solution. We dictate what it is, and the end product is not as good as it should be. The next one is the activity trap. This is especially common in services types of contracts where the buying organization pays for every single transaction, whether that is actually needed or not. So maybe they're paying based on the per hour that a janitorial supplier works, or every day that the customer service, or per shipment if it's a 3PL, per order, per mile if it's a truck driver, per call if it's a customer service type of organization, where every single transaction has a cost associated with it. So what that means is that there is absolutely no incentive for the supplier to reduce the number of activities that they're performing. And because if they did that, that would lead to lower revenue. So why would they try to streamline the processes and make it better? So the more activity they perform, the more money they make. So they want to be busy, they want to be active. And again, maybe that's not the best solution. Maybe we need to look at streamlining and trying to minimize the actual activity that we're doing, instead of incentivizing our supplier to do more and more and more. The next one we have is our junkyard dog factor. So if any of you have ever seen The Sandlot, that big scary dog that eats all their baseballs, just think of like a big menacing bulldog that's just standing his ground and is not going to back down, and he's going to protect that junkyard for all it's worth, even if it's just garbage in there. And they are going to be mean, they're going to be ferocious, and they are not going to let go. So this is, again, very prevalent when you are outsourcing services and you're working with a supplier for services. And usually there's a lot of really good reasons. We talked about all the good reasons why companies decide to outsource and use suppliers, especially a desire to focus on our core competencies. However, when the decision to outsource is actually made, sometimes it can mean that internal jobs are lost, or they could be transferred from us as the buying organization to the supplier. And if you're a person who has one of these jobs, you don't want to lose your job. So you're incentivized to stand your ground and be as ferocious as the junkyard dog. So employees who are kind of on the chopping block will often go to very great lengths to protect their job, their well-being. They're going to go to great lengths to hunker down, to draw that line in the sand, claiming that certain processes must stay in-house. So a lot of times they will end up, it leads to duplication of effort, as the organization tries to like micromanage the supplier to ensure that it's being done right, when in actuality, this person is just trying to save their job. And perhaps in certain capacities, they may be trying to sabotage the supplier because they want to keep their job. So we understand why they would do that, but it doesn't mean that, it means that the contract and the relationship is not what it should be. So this is the junkyard dog factor. The honeymoon effect. So for those of you who had a boyfriend or girlfriend, especially for those first few weeks, first few months, you go through the honeymoon stage. It's blissful, it's carefree, you're deep in love, they can do no wrong. We're both partners, they're just starting to get to know each other, and everything they do is cute and fun, and there's no fault with them. Everything that your partner does, from how they eat, their manners, the stories, how they sneeze, is charming and endearing. However, the honeymoon phase is just that. It is a phase and it will pass. Eventually it's going to end, and both partners are going to have to adjust to this new, more sustainable reality. And you're going to start to get annoyed with your partner. They're going to do things that you don't like. So just like with a romantic relationships between a buyer and seller go through a honeymoon stage as well. So all new supplier relationships go through some kind of honeymoon stage. At the beginning of the relationships, we're both really positive, the outset of this new relationship. And maybe we only see the positive things because that's what we want to see. But our satisfaction levels are going to drop over time as we come to really see the reality. Especially in the beginning, the suppliers are going to jump through a lot of hoops. They're going to ramp everything up. They're going to collect revenue from their new client. But over time, the excitement, the newness is going to wear off. So they brought their A team to us in the beginning, but now they've moved on to their next deal, perhaps leaving the B, maybe even the C team, to keep that relationship going. And it's kind of like that complacent partner that doesn't do their fair share. That's what the supplier can be. So they remain very conscientious about meeting the buying organization's expectations, but it never goes beyond that point. Again, that supplier gets very complacent in that relationship. And the honeymoon effect is going to linger on, even when performance levels for those services or those supplies may be improving industry-wide, they're not improving. So the supplier just doesn't have any incentive to raise service levels or to decrease the price, even if industry levels are improving. So this is the honeymoon effect. And we've got sandbagging. So I know I've got a lot of athletes out there. You've probably heard of the term sandbagging. So what sandbagging is, this is a strategy of lowering the expectations of a company or an individual's strengths or core competencies in order to produce greater than anticipated results. So it's all about setting the level of expectation. If I go to practice and I am playing like garbage, I am slow, I am sluggish, I could be sandbagging. I could be deliberately performing at a lower level than I'm actually capable of. And I'm setting the bar very low. So then when the big game comes and they put me in and I knock everyone's socks off, everyone says, oh my gosh, she is so great. But it's only because I was sandbagging at practice and I wasn't really practicing up to my true potential. So this happens in business as well. So a typical outsourcing example of sandbagging. So the supplier will sandbag and they'll only offer up savings in very small increments over time. They're going to say, oh, it's so hard. We're not going to be able to get you these savings, even if they know that they could. So rather than establish the highest level of savings achievable as early as possible, which would be most beneficial for the buying organization, they offer it slowly over time. They're sandbagging us. And again, they do this because they think, why deliver everything up front when we know that we have a customer that is just going to continually hammer us for more savings next year, next quarter. So this is an example of sandbagging, when the supplier is going to hold on us and sandbag us. The next one we have is the zero-sum game. So contracting parties, the buyer and the seller, will typically play the zero-sum game. And the zero-sum game boils down to very binary thinking. If I win, you lose. If you win, I lose. And it turns it into that us versus them mentality. So if any of you have ever taken game theory, you've probably heard of the zero-sum game. And the players on each side, the buyer and the seller, just don't understand that the sum of the parts together can be better. We can both get more if we combine our efforts effectively. So when organizations work collaboratively together, the results are always better than if they had worked separately or at cross purposes. So it's really hard to get two different players to realize that if we communicate, if we collaborate, it's going to be better for both of us. And many organizations think of this as a zero-sum game. If I win, you lose. If you win, I lose. And that's how a lot of companies think of it. So trying to get them to move away from that zero-sum game is very difficult. Driving blind disease. So this typically afflicts companies who have not really done their research, not done their homework, not properly prepared for outsourcing and working with a supplier. So they're going to really rush to get that contract signed, get that deal in process, but they don't actually figure out how they're going to measure success of the relationship or of that supplier. There's no formal governance process to monitor the performance of the relationship. And ultimately, it ends up failing because there's a very unclear definition of success. And companies, it's easier usually to track costs. That is something that we have to do anyway, just for accounting purposes. And it's harder and a lot of times a lot more difficult and time intensive to actually manage performance. So this is when we're just going into it blind. We don't know how success looks, and that's going to mean that both parties are not going to be happy with the outcome. Then we've got measurement minutia. This is when we try to measure every little thing that the supplier does. We have so many metrics. We have a binder full of all the things that we are keeping track of what this company does. And it's difficult and impossible to manage just the sheer volume of all the metrics being used. And again, once we even have those metrics, what do we make of them? There's so many of them. What is the most important? It's not uncommon to find spreadsheets from certain buying organizations that have 50 to 100 metrics on them on how they're measuring their suppliers. And that is just too much. You can't make sense of that. The data is not useful. It's just taking up time that we just don't have. It's just not worth. We're not getting bang for our buck with measuring every little thing that this supplier does. So when the critical factors of success are actually understood, usually we are going to have, the ideal number is going to be 5 to 10 key performance indicators, KPIs, no more than that. So if we par down the number of metrics, that allows both us as the buying organization and the supplier to really focus on what matters and not simply measuring for measuring's sake, or what can we measure? Measurement minutia is very often associated with companies who are suffering from the junkyard dog factor, with people who may lose their jobs and they're really digging in and say, we can't outsource this, or with agreements that have fallen into the activity trap. So we are paying them for every single transaction that they do. So again, we only want to focus on what really matters and measure those items instead of focusing on everything we could ever measure. And then the power of doing nothing. So this happens when we establish measures for the sake of measures. We don't think about how we're actually going to use these to manage our business. We don't compile them. We don't initiate any corrective actions. We don't monitor performance. Then obviously we can't expect positive results. We are just letting our vendors and our suppliers do whatever they want, and we're not doing anything as the buying organization. So this is one of our outsourcing ailments. Okay, so we've talked about contracts and POs. We've talked about the 10 outsourcing ailments that can happen if you don't have a good structure to your agreement. Now let's talk about step 6, follow-up and expediting. So after issuing the PO or issuing a contract, the buyer may follow up or they may expedite the order. So follow-up is a very routine order tracking to ensure the supplier can meet their delivery promises. Usually this happens there'll be a follow-up date. Sometimes that will be indicated with the order in terms of when I'm going to be following up. We can make progress inquiries. It could be by phone, it could be by email, it could be in person. It could even be through some sort of technology platform that we're using. And the reason why buying organizations do this is because we want to ensure that everything is all set. And if there is something wrong, we want early notification of problems. This allows us as the procurement organization to take appropriate action if needed. There could be problems like production scheduling on the supplier's end, or the quality or the delivery date. So usually you're going to have a lot more stringent follow-up on really strategic or critical spend, especially things that are really high dollar amounts, or perhaps have a very long lead time that are critical to our core competencies or the products or service that we make. And we may want to know about advanced shipping notices, or perhaps the percentage of the production process that has been completed as a certain date. So this is very common in procurement. It's just a follow-up. We want notification of where everything stands. They don't need, technically they're not contracted to deliver something yet, but we want an update. And expediting. So I've got a couple of pictures of a bird dog here. So if any of you are hunting and you've got a hunting dog, you know that these types of dogs they follow those birds and they will not let them rest. So sometimes you'll hear the term bird dogging. So what expediting is, this is the application of pressure to the supplier to meet the original delivery promise, or sometimes even to deliver ahead of schedule or to speed up delivery of a delayed order. And we could threaten them with order cancellation or loss of future business, that they'll never do business with us again if they don't actually expedite on this order. So we're going to put a little pressure on them. And expediting usually is only necessary on a very small percentages of what we buy or of the POs that we have issued. If we have done a good job as the buying organization of sourcing, analyzing our supplier capabilities, setting their expectations accordingly, and setting the contracts in place well, we're only going to be using reliable suppliers. So if we are having a lot of frequent expediting, if we have vendors that are going to be delivering late and we've got to put pressure on them, we've got to threaten them, this could be caused on our end by poor planning and may indicate the need that we need to focus perhaps on some process improvement. So step 7, receipt and inspection. So we've got to actually get our goods or services. So the proper receipt of goods and services, making sure that we are getting what we actually order, is very, very important. So the primary purpose of receiving is to confirm that the order that we placed has actually arrived. Check that the shipment is in good condition, the box is not mangled, the actual product itself is not broken. Ensure that the quantity we ordered has been received. If we ordered 100, we want to make sure that there are exactly 100. Ensure that the proper documentation of the receipt is registered and accessible to all parties. So we want to make sure that we've actually gotten what we've ordered. And then step 8, invoice clearing and payment. So of course, the supplier wants to get paid. And usually they will issue us an invoice. So an invoice is a supplier claim against us as the buying organization. Typically, it shows the order number, the itemized price, the total final price, and usually the procurement department and accounts payable or AP department are usually jointly responsible for paying and clearing all supplier invoices. Late payments on our end as the buying organization, where we are not paying our suppliers on time, are a primary cause for poor supplier performance. Again, if we're paying them late or not paying on time, not paying in the right amount, they're going to say, why are we putting in all this effort? Why are we trying to do a good job when you're not doing a good job with us? So it's going to end up deteriorating our relationships, or maybe they build in higher prices to protect themselves or to penalize us because we're not paying them in time. So we want to ensure that we pay our suppliers the right amount and on time. And step 9, Maintenance of records and relationships. So the final step of our procurement process is to update our records. And that includes our supplier performance scorecards. How well are they doing? How well are they delivering the products and services that we've asked for? How well are they meeting all of those key performance indicators in their contracts? So these could be electronic files, they could be hard copies of any sort of order related documents. We should have these stored, we should have these filed. So some examples of documents that we would have would be the purchase order, the contract, the proof of receipt, the invoice, the payment documentation. And there's a lot of different legal and accounting standards or company practice or just common sense that determine which records are kept and how long they're kept for, but usually these should be kept for at least 7 years within the organization. And we're going to collect a lot of data throughout this procurement process, and we're going to store that in records. So we're going to have a lot of data about what we're buying. We're going to have a lot of data on our suppliers. We're going to have a lot of data on price, on quantities. Turning that data into usable knowledge is a continuing challenge. Often the problem is not that we have a lack of data, but we have information overload. We have too much to look at, and we have something called analysis paralysis, where there's so much data that we're paralyzed and we can't do anything with it because there's just so much of it. It would take so much time and effort just to get through the data to make any sense of it. So this is usually we have more than enough data internally, but actually doing some with that data is usually the harder part. And supplier relationships, just like the relationships that we have with our friends, with our family, we want to have good relationships with our suppliers. These are affected throughout the entire procurement process. They could be started, they could be developed and nurtured, they could be damaged, they could be repaired, or they could be severed. So relationships with our key suppliers should be developed and assessed throughout the process. We want to ensure that we're nurturing those relationships. We want to assess them. Are they good? Are they bad? Strong supplier relationships are very important to supply chain success. We talked about the amount of spend that all businesses are doing with suppliers, and they are imperative to our own success. So we want to ensure that we have very strong relationships with our suppliers. However, not all suppliers are going to be strategic partners. Usually those really good special relationships can only exist and can only be developed and nurtured and fostered with just a few select suppliers, kind of like your friends. You may have a lot of acquaintances and they're fine and all, but you're probably going to only have just a handful of really good, true best friends. The same is true with relationships with suppliers. And these long-term relationships that are win-win for both parties take time, just like our personal relationships. We need to put in the time and the effort to foster those relationships, to nurture them and ensure they grow and ensure that there's trust between all parties. Now let's talk about ethical sourcing. So for a product or service to be what is considered ethically sourced, it has to meet certain ethical standards. That could be that the organization, our suppliers, or perhaps the entire supply chain have things like decent working conditions. We are using good business ethics all the way down to our suppliers, that people working are all paid fair wages. A lot of times ethical sourcing practices include promoting diversity from intentionally buying from maybe small firms, maybe ethnic minority businesses, or even women-owned businesses. And it also typically includes discontinuing or stopping any purchases from firms that use things like child labor or any other kind of acceptable labor practice, or buying from firms in underdeveloped nations where their ethical practices are still suspect. And the reason why I say many companies will discontinue buying from developing nations is because it can be risky. There could be potential human rights, animal rights, safety or environmental abuses that may be associated with the firm suppliers in these foreign facilities. It could lead to negative publicity for the entire buying organization, including things like boycotts. It could tarnish our company image. We could be all over the news, how we're associated with this. It could degrade our brand, and it could lower our employee morale, even for the employees that are located in our home country. And ultimately, this is going to lead to lower sales, lower profit, lower stock prices, and that's going to hurt our bottom line. So we want to ensure that we're ethically sourcing. And this is from the UN nations, just to give you a gauge of where developed countries are and developing countries. So anything in green, that is considered a developed country. So we've got the US, we've got Canada, we've got Australia, we've got Western Europe, Japan. Anything in yellow is considered an economy in transition. So it looks primarily like Eastern Europe and Russia are economies in transition. And then we've got our developing countries. That's primarily Mexico, Central and South America, the Caribbean. That is China, India, parts of Southwest Asia, parts of Africa and the Middle East. And then our least developed countries are primarily in Asia and in Africa. So we want to be very careful when we're buying from, especially these countries that are in red or in orange, because these are potentially very risky for us. They might not have the same level of environmental standards or human rights standards that we have in more of the developed countries. So a problem with this occurred to Nike in the mid-1990s. So we all know who Nike is. They make athletic wear, they make sportswear. So in the mid-1990s, Nike had contracted with Pakistani suppliers to make soccer balls. And unfortunately, that work was then further subcontracted out to local villagers, where essentially they had children, children as young as 10, were actually sewing these soccer balls together. So you see a picture of this young Pakistani child, looks like he's in a very dirty area, not what you would consider a production area, sewing soccer balls. Again, children as young as 10. And very similar problems for Nike also cropped up with child labor in both Cambodia and Malaysia at this time. So in 1998, the then CEO, Phil Knight, he acknowledged that the Nike product has been synonymous with slave wages, forced overtime, and arbitrary abuse. So he came out and he said, yes, we're aware of what happened with our suppliers. And he also noted, I truly believe the American consumer does not want to buy products made under abusive conditions. And then Nike then pledged to reform this company image. So they wanted to get away from what is considered unethical sourcing. So for example, in Malaysia, Nike reimbursed workers. They paid them to relocate them to factories. And so they weren't doing it in their homes. And they actually met with representatives for 30 different Malaysian factories about enforcing labor standards that met what the USA deemed as ethical. So again, even some of the biggest companies in the world have gone through problems with ethical sourcing. So to minimize risks, ethical sourcing policies should include things like determining where all purchased goods come from and how they were actually made, knowing if our suppliers actually promote basic workplace principles, such as right to equal opportunity, actually earning a decent wage, prohibition of child labor or forced labor, use of ethical rating for suppliers alongside other performance criteria, reporting of supplier nonconformance to us, and providing detailed ethical sourcing expectations to our suppliers. If they don't know what we expect, how can we expect them to actually enforce that? So we actually have to communicate what our expectations are with ethical sourcing to all of our suppliers. However, the actual execution, again, that all sounds good and well on paper, right? Easy peasy. But the actual execution of ethical sourcing practices is usually easier said than done. Modern supply chains, especially when nowadays with globalization, encompass usually many, many different countries. And each country has its own set of labor issues. They've got their own set of wages. They've got their own working and living conditions. And many companies, a lot of times, aren't even aware of their complete supply chains beyond their first tier suppliers and customers. So we don't know our suppliers. We don't know where that is coming from. That is very hard to trace in a lot of supply chains. We may know who we buy from, our first tier supplier, but we don't know who their supplier is. We don't know who that supplier is. So sometimes it's hard to actually know the entire supply chain. So for example, Nike footwear, we'll talk about Nike again. They have 150 contract apparel factories in 14 different countries. Their footwear. They have 150 factories in 14 different countries. And their apparel, so like the clothing, is supplied by 430 factories in 41 different countries. That's a lot of different countries. It's a lot of different manufacturing facilities, just to keep track of all that, to ensure that every single factory in every single country is meeting the needs and the ethical standards is very difficult. So purchasing of fair trade products is an activity that's becoming more popular as a lot of companies are trying to demonstrate a more ethical approach to sourcing. So you'll see in the graphic that I've got here, they've got a fair trade little logo. So a fair trade product, if you see this little logo on something, a fair trade product is something that has been manufactured or grown by a disadvantaged producer in a developing country that's actually receiving a fair price for its goods. So they are being paid a fair market value, even though they are coming from a developed country. So if you see anything with this marking on it, that's what a fair trade product means. So a lot of companies are buying more and more fair trade products just to demonstrate their ethical approach to sourcing. Usually this refers to foodstuffs, farming products, so coffee, cocoa, bananas, sugar, tea, cotton. And usually these products are produced in developing nations and then exported to larger companies in more developed nations for further processing. And the focus on ethical sourcing, this is a relatively new trend, probably within the last 25, 30 years. In recent years, there have been really major success stories of companies that have gone really out of their way to make sourcing and manufacturing ethical and responsible. And this is a good thing. These companies have boosted the reputation of their brand. The customers see them in a great light, but also have ensured that the workers that are within that supply chain are being treated well and they're being treated fairly. So let's talk about some of the success stories. So Starbucks. So Starbucks strives to always buy coffee at fair prices and ensures that each step of the coffee planting, the coffee harvesting, the processing and purchasing is always done ethically. And this is probably why they're a little bit higher priced compared to the coffee you would get at a gas station. They even use third parties to verify that its sourcing is ethical. A lot of times, if you have internally, you are using verification processes, you may fudge it a little bit or say, we'll let this slide. But if you have it done by a third party, they're probably going to be a little bit more stringent than you would be internally. The standard that is set by Starbucks is now recognized as the industry standard for all ethical sourcing. So they're really leading the way. So if you go get a Starbucks coffee, you can feel pretty good about it because you know that they're ethically sourcing all of their direct materials. And we see here, a lot of the biggest coffee producing countries are from these less developed nations. So Brazil actually makes the most coffee. Then we've got Vietnam, we've got Colombia, we've got Indonesia, we've got Ethiopia. So these are all countries that are not developed, they are still developing. So it's really focusing on ensuring that the farmers, the people growing these and processing, everything having to do with the coffee product are paid fair wages. So Starbucks works with over 170,000 farmers each year, and they generate billions of dollars in revenue every single year. And Starbucks' ability to be both profitable, again, at the end of the day, it comes down to making money, and ensuring that our shareholders are happy. So they have been able to remain very profitable and also set the industry standard for ethical sourcing, has really been a really shining example in our coffee industry and in American businesses. H&M. Now, usually when you think of fast fashion, you don't think of good supply chain practices or ethical supply chain practices, but H&M clothing retailer, H&M, they are committed to supply chain transparency. And what I mean by transparency is they want people to know who their suppliers are, and they're not going to try to hide it from anyone. So since 2013, H&M has published a list of almost 99% of their suppliers' names, the suppliers' addresses on their website, and they update it on a quarterly basis. So what that means is that anyone can go look at this list and verify if these suppliers that H&M uses actually lives up to the standards set by the supplier. They're not trying to keep them quiet or hide them under the rug. And this also ensures that they can be held publicly accountable for the conduct of their suppliers. If one of these suppliers is found to be using child labor, it's all out there and they have to be held accountable. H&M also has a responsible sourcing goal of only using 100% recycled or sustainably sourced materials by the year 2030. And really, again, this makes H&M a trendsetter and a sustainable and ethical leader in clothing retail. And in terms of ethical sourcing, most view the fashion industry as very problematic, especially fast fashion. And if a leading clothing manufacturer or retailer like H&M can demonstrate its dedication to these ethical practices, while again also being profitable like Starbucks, there's a potential to change this reputation as well, and also to get other retailers to follow their example. Now let's talk about environmental and green sourcing, very closely related to ethical sourcing, kind of two sides to the same coin. So the notion of protecting the Earth's environment has been a topic of concern for many years. We know that pollution, that what we are doing to the Earth as humans is not a good thing. So there's an increased consumer awareness of what we'll call green issues. These are issues that consumers care about that include the environment, that include sustainability, that include energy costs, the availability of energy. So because consumers are very concerned with this, organizations have thus placed greater emphasis on ensuring that our company decisions do not cause harm, or we somehow are providing benefit to the environment at large. This is environmental or green sourcing. So this is a practice aimed at ensuring that the products and services or materials that we're purchasing meet the environmental objectives of our organization. So it could be objectives like waste reduction, like hazardous material elimination, could be about recycling goals, remanufacturing or reusing materials. So we want to purchase from suppliers that consider the environmental aspects of all these products and services that we're buying. We want to make environmentally conscious decisions throughout the entire procurement process, beginning with actual product design and process design, all the way through product disposal, putting things into landfill. So a lot of the very common environmental sourcing considerations include CO2 reduction. You hear a lot about CO2 footprint now and trying to reduce that. Looking at alternative energies, instead of using coal or petroleum, can we use solar? Can we use wind? Water management. Sustainable agriculture, making sure that we're not leaching all of the nutrients from the soil and then leaving the soil just a waste. Marine resource management, making sure we're not hurting any of the wildlife in our streams and our oceans, protection of natural ecosystems, and then pollution and waste management. Green sourcing usually considers environmental factors as well as the very typical price and quality considerations when we're making our procurement decisions. Companies and government agencies are coming to realize that every single purchase that we make has some sort of global environmental impact. So if we're doing very careful sourcing, we can really save money and also precious resources related to our environment as well. So for example, we know that the collection, the transport, manufacturing all require the use of fossil fuels. We can purchase goods from distant suppliers that are halfway across the world. That's going to require greater amounts of fuel for transportation. We also know that if we transport via ship or rail, we're using less fuel than trucks or airlines. We also know that plant-based goods usually have a smaller environmental impact than petroleum-based goods, like any sort of plastics. If we have a factory that's powered by solar or wind energy, we're going to have a smaller environmental impact than factories that are powered by oil or coal. So these are some of the trade-offs that we're going to look at if we're doing environmental or green sourcing. Now let's take a look at an example of companies who have not properly performed green sourcing. So some of the world's leading clothing brands, probably could be some of the brands of clothing that you're wearing right now, relied on two big Chinese suppliers. So the name of these two suppliers were Youngor Textile Complex and Well Dyeing Factory Limited. And in 2011, so about 12, 13, 14 years ago, these two companies were found to be polluting local rivers in China with hormone disrupting chemicals that had been banned in Europe and other parts of the world. And this was found out through a Greenpeace investigation that they had done. And again, these two clothing brands were used in a lot of different clothing that we wear here. So some of the clothing brands that were purchasing from these suppliers were Adidas, were Nike again, were Calvin Klein, were Lacoste, were Abercrombie and Fitch. These were some of the big global clothing names that were identified to these Chinese suppliers. And again, obviously they were not doing their due diligence to understand what their suppliers were doing and ensuring that they were buying from also environmentally conscious suppliers. And they all confirmed, yeah, we source products from at least one of these Chinese suppliers. So they were not doing their proper due diligence. Now let's talk about a company that's done it very well. So Patagonia, this is a brand that I really love. Very into the outdoors. I like hiking, and Patagonia makes fantastic outwear garments, especially if you're into outdoorsy kind of things. So they have been a company that's been very successful on focusing on environmental issues, including in their procurement practices, in their environmental and green sourcing. So they're an outdoor American clothing company. They have used organically grown cotton for all of its products since 1994, which at that point they switched away from very pesticide-heavy cotton crops. And they have also altered their entire supply chain to ensure that they've gotten very environmentally friendly and also very safe, ethical working conditions for all their employees. So they've built a very strong reputation for being ethical, environmentally friendly, and definitely utilizing green sourcing. And that positive reputation only strengthens their brand and gives really conscientious consumers more incentive to buy. A lot of times, especially because they are more associated with outdoors, the people who would be interested in these products are more environmentally focused. So it gives them an edge up from their competitors. And a little bit about Patagonia. So it was actually started by a very eccentric rock climber, Yvon Chouinard, and he became a billionaire through the founding of Patagonia. And he's getting older, and rather than selling the company or taking it public, in 2022, his family and he transferred their ownership of Patagonia, which is valued at that time at $3 billion, to a trust and a nonprofit organization. And they did this to preserve the company's independence and ensure that all of their profits, which are about $100 million a year, are used to combat climate change and protect underdeveloped land all around the globe. So they truly live, they walk the walk, and they have done a great job of focusing on environmental and green sourcing as part of their core business. Organizations usually will initiate environmental sourcing for a lot of different reasons, but perhaps the most important is to improve customer relations and contribute to a better public image. We as the customers are becoming more green conscious, and we have begun to recognize the significance of these sort of supply chain sustainability efforts. So green sourcing can really help companies improve their financial results, make more money, make more revenue, and allowing them to meet their cost reduction goals while simultaneously boosting revenues. So that is it for sourcing and procurement. I will see you at our next lesson. Thank you so much.